So this year, the lecture is Trump, the ugly face of capitalism. April Theses, 1917-2017. I used Trump just to get the crowd. So now that you're here, right. The British playwright Edward Bond has remarked that if you cannot face Hiroshima in the theatre, then you will face Hiroshima itself. Harvard professor Elaine Scarry recently observed that some of her students had never heard of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Scary indeed, as Harvard is one of the most prestigious private Ivy League universities in the United States. With the inauguration of Donald Trump as President of the United States, the need to face the ugly truth of capitalism today is more urgent than any other crisis in the history of humanity. It is a wake-up call that the Holocaust deniers, the climate change deniers, those who turn the blind eye to the abuses and dirty tricks of the imperial powers at home and abroad, must now be confronted head on. Not with the knowing tones of a condescending intellectual superiority, but with the forthright tones of a real alternative. An alternative that exists in the present and that begins with Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Auschwitz. So if we cannot face the ugly history of the past 100 years, then we are on for a repetition. Sorry, and I keep forgetting to do this. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Donald Trump, inauguration of Donald Trump, and of course, the gates of Auschwitz. Work sets you free. So if we cannot face this ugly history for the past 100 years, we are on for a repetition. From the slaughters of World Wars I and II, when the imperial powers fought over the redivision of the globe, to the extermination of the European Jews, from the failure of Lenin's communist experiment to the crimes of Stalin, from the continued interference by Western powers in the emergent democracies of their former colonies and neo-colonies in Africa, South America, and Asia, to their war crimes continuing into this new century in the Middle East and North Africa. The dark story of the Congo is proving to be the new normal in Africa. Around 1900, Joseph Conrad and Roger Casement recorded the abuses and exploitation of the native population under Leopold, King of the Belgians, for the extraction of rubber, for the pneumatic tires and inner tubes of the newly invented motor car. Ever since then, the Congo has experienced internal conflict from foreign-sponsored warlords and militias. Today, the Congo has more war casualties than any other conflict since World War II. For, in addition to rubber from such as the Firestone plantations, there is the extraction of diamonds, uranium, copper, zinc, and more recently, the extraction of the mineral coltan, the source of niobium and tantalum, required in the new computer and mobile phone technologies that keep the Western world wired. We affirm that there is an alternative to neoliberal capitalism, that there is no truth in Thatcher's famous assertion that there is no alternative. Even Thatcher herself did not insist that neoliberal capitalism was necessarily good, nor that it was the least bad option, but that it was our only option, and that it conformed to our human nature. Our affirmation resists this Thatcherite conviction and insists that the historical destiny for humanity can be glorious and need not be in the unnatural and monstrous inequalities of a system that requires the human subject to conform to the contemporary stupidity with its injunctions to consume, work, vote, and then shut up. One of the political consequences of accepting the vision of no alternative is that all the governments of the world, the socialist government in France, the radical Syriza government in Greece, the Communist Party of China, the government of the United States, the governments of Japan, of Russia, of India, and of Ireland adopt as a first principle the policy of appeasement with the market and its institutions. At the level of the state, therefore, all political decisions are made in strict subservience to globalized capitalism, with its incomprehensible inequalities, such that in today's world, the 8 richest people own as much as 3.5 billion poorest people. That's 9 zeros, and they're all real people. As social inequality has become more extreme, it has become increasingly difficult to maintain the pretense that democracy still prevails. The electoral victory of Donald Trump has exposed how a so-called democratic consensus can be massaged into place with all the resources of the mogul-controlled media and the psychological profiling by the big data companies, together with not a small dose of the secret state and its dirty tricks. However, it must be stressed that Trump is not some sort of monstrous interloper in an otherwise flawed but essentially decent society. Rather, Trump is the product of the criminal and diseased coupling of the finance, insurance, real estate, entertainment industries with the armed and deep state. There he is on his inauguration day with his armed state. His is the genuine face of the rentier class, the oligarchy that rules the United States. And this face is ugly. With Trump's tweeting finger next to the nuclear button, we are convinced that it is worth trying another human experiment, however hazardous, rather than risk a nuclear apocalypse, or a climate change apocalypse, or a resource depletion apocalypse, or a food shortage apocalypse, or whatever apocalypse you're having yourself. Our conviction is such that with Donald Trump in the White House, the dogma of the no alternative is just not credible anymore, and the space for any skepticism has simply vanished. So our task tonight is to propose a political orientation that goes beyond the Thatcherite vision towards a different destiny for human beings. In doing so, we will resurrect the idea that against the monstrous inequalities of the status quo Against the new gangsters emerging out of classical politics, it is possible to propose yet another attempt at the egalitarian hypothesis. As Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, put it in a recent speech, but our response to these challenges, Brexit, the migration crisis, religiously motivated violence and terrorism, etc., must be to reach for the common good rather than the barriers of the past. Now let's look at the parallels between 1917 and 2017. So in affirming that there is an alternative to neoliberal capitalism, that an alternative to neoliberal capitalism exists in the present, it is important that we take a detour back to the Russian Revolution of 1917, for this did succeed in installing for 75 years an alternative narrative that really frightened capitalism. Now, 25 years after the collapse of the USSR and the restoration of power to the kleptocracy, it is impossible to deny that the entire world has entered a period of profound economic, political, and social crises, as all the unresolved conflicts that erupted as World War I are re-emerging today with such explosive force that the events in Russia in 1917 have become intensely relevant for us. But before we head back in time, we need to take further stock of the situation in the present. 2017. For anyone looking for a peaceful life, 2016 was already the year from hell. And 2017 has commenced as if it emerged from deeper in the inferno. The friction of geopolitical and economic competition is fraying allegiances even among the closest post-World War II allies. Germany is discarding the last vestiges of its post-Nazi pacifism and is seeking to translate its economic strength into military power. Japan is doing likewise. All the structures of world politics established after World War II are rapidly disintegrating under the opposition between the irresistible force of inexorable economic globalization and the immovable object of the restriction of the nation state. 2017 sees the accelerated breakdown of the European Union, as exemplified in Brexit and in the growth of extreme right-wing nationalism. The rise of Trump is mirrored by the growth of the political influence of the National Front in France, Pegida in Germany, the Five Star Movement in Italy, and UKIP in England. 2017 has also witnessed the relentless intensification of military tensions, such that the likelihood of worldwide conflagration, World War III, is openly discussed in countless books, journals, and newspapers. Even Pope Francis recently declared that today, sadly, we find ourselves engaged in a horrifying world war, fought piecemeal. Worse, the innumerable regional tensions are developing into an increasingly direct and open confrontation involving nuclear-armed powers. No one can say for sure who will fight whom. Will the US move first against China? Or must that conflict be delayed until after accounts have been settled with Russia? This question is the subject of bitter strategic debate and turmoil within the highest echelons of the US state. The military disasters of the past quarter century, Serbia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Ukraine, Syria, etc., have been compounded by the deterioration in the global economic stature of the United States that has found direct expression in living standards experienced by the broad mass of its population. According to the economist Thomas Piketty, the pre-tax share of national income received by the bottom half of the US population has fallen from 20% in 1980 to 12% today. The younger generation is drowning in debt, unable to earn enough to start a family or move out of their parents' homes. In 2015, for the first time in more than 2 decades, the life expectancy in the US fell due to the rise in mortality from suicide, drug abuse, and other manifestations of social crisis. 1917. World War I, lasting from July 1914 to November 1918, was a global war that originated in Europe but drew in all the world's great economic powers. The Entente, or Allied powers, consisting initially of Russia, France, and the UK, including Ireland, were later joined by Italy, Japan, and the United States, versus the Central powers, consisting of Germany and Austria-Hungary, joined later by the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. More than 70 million military personnel were mobilized, of which over 9 million died. 7 million civilians also died. The scale of the slaughter was due to the sheer ineptness of the officer caste that regarded their soldiers as an endless supply of cannon fodder, and was exacerbated in turn by the technological and industrial sophistication of the war machine, coupled with the tactical stalemate of grueling trench warfare. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in history to that date, and it paved the way for major political changes, sparking revolutions in many countries, including Ireland and Russia. The inner turmoil of the Russian Social Democratic Party during the year 1917 is relevant for our argument tonight. In February, the moderate Menshevik faction overthrew the Tsar and seized power from the feudal autocracy. By April, many of the diktats of the Tsar had been rescinded, and revolutionaries in exile were allowed to return home. A sealed train is one that travels under customs or immigration seal without its contents officially entering the nations traversed from the beginning to the end of the journey. The most notorious use of the sealed train was the transporting of Lenin home from exile in Switzerland to arrive in St. Petersburg on the 3rd of April. Yesterday was the 3rd of April. We had another explosion yesterday in St. Petersburg, didn't we? However, by this date, the Mensheviks had not yet rescinded the most important diktat of the autocracy, the one that had led to the overthrow of the Tsar in the first place: the engagement of Russia in the war, in which the soldiers of the Russian army had not enough food or boots, let alone arms and ammunition. Already in 1914, at the outbreak of the war, Lenin had been shocked and dismayed that all the main parties of the international social democratic movement had reneged on their agreed pre-war resolution to maintain a united front against the war. They adopted instead the patriotic line of joining the war effort of their respective nation state, and had thereby participated in consigning their respective workers to the slaughter. On his arrival back in Russia, Lenin immediately understood that the Menshevik faction was intent on continuing with this patriotic line, in spite of their successful seizure of power. This was Lenin's moment of truth, for he saw the unique chance for ending the war and of fully securing power in the hands of the workers and peasants. On the 4th of April, 100 years ago, on this very date, Lenin presented his proposals to the Russian Social Democratic Party in what became known as the April Theses. There's Lenin arriving back in St. Petersburg from the sealed train, and here's Lenin's April Theses. His proposals were met with derision by the majority of even his own radical Bolshevik faction, who were proud of their participation in the February Revolution and regarded the stance of the newly arrived émigré with a haughty disdain. The editorial board of the Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda, dissociated both themselves and the party from the theses, while one board member, Bogdanov, described them as the delirium of a madman. Even Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, conceded that it looked as if Lenin had gone crazy. But by patiently arguing for his theses, he successfully attracted the Trotsky group into his faction and reoriented the Bolsheviks so that their October Revolution was successful. Besides being in the middle of a world war, Lenin had two other crucial factors in his favor. Firstly, his centralist Bolshevik faction was a disciplined unit, having been forged in the white heat of the earlier 1905 revolution. And secondly, in that earlier revolution, the Russian workers and peasants had gained the experience of organizing themselves in local committees called Soviets that established a national representative structure parallel to, but independent of the conventional parliamentary one. However, we do not have such factors on our side tonight. So we need to examine the prospects for an alternative politics in our concrete circumstances today. So let's do that. I'll have a drink of water, get me whistle back, because we're coming to the meat of the argument. So a century after the global slaughter of World War I, the world economic powers are on course to plunge humanity into yet another global catastrophe, preferring to exterminate human life on planet Earth than question their dogma of the no alternative. It is imperative that the powers and principalities be confronted with a population that grasps that a real alternative to capitalism is possible and can be made to exist, one that is based on the reappropriation of socially created value from private hands and on its redistribution to social humanity. Human beings create value by their very existence as social beings living within a culture. The fact that we sit on a chair to eat our breakfast from a table gives the chair, table, bowl, spoon, etc. a value, over and above the specific labour and materials that go into their production. This hidden value is usually appropriated as unearned income by the rentier class and must now be uncovered, reappropriated and redistributed to society at large. Akin to the religious concept of grace, socially generated value arises not from work, but from our human existence as social beings. And expressed in monetary form, it is the material base of the fiduciary or money issue, and validates the argument for a minimum basic income for all. (2016 and 2017 bear witness to political disorder across the world. The decomposition of the classical political parties, Democrat, Republican, Socialist, centre-right, centre-left, even the old certainties of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in Ireland, are obliged to engage in an unstable new politics. We also bear witness to the frustration with the old political order by the poor and the dispossessed, by the peasants of many countries, by the unemployed workers, essentially by all those people who are being progressively reduced to nothing. What Marx referred to as the proletariat in the brutality of contemporary capitalism. All these people from the Rust Belt areas already devastated by Thatcherite capitalism and who are lured by the false promises of work and freedom by Marine Le Pen in France, who helped swell the electoral vote for Nigel Farage's Brexit in the UK and for Donald Trump in the United States, must be shown the utter falsity of these promises. Contrary to the words wrought over the gates of Auschwitz, work does not set you free. We must in turn be cautious of the worn-out socialist slogan, "Workers of the world unite," as it too can fall into the error of fetishizing work and of unwillingly aligning its desire with the fascist promises. In order to prevent such a disaster, the mass population must have a clear path towards the construction of an alternative world. But where can the masses of generic humanity find such a path today? Certainly not in the forces of the conventional left, who are in much the same state of paralysis today as the Mensheviks were back in April 1917. In turn, the parties of the radical left, those claiming direct lineage from Lenin and the October Revolution, have been in a state of disintegration since old Stalin's time, and have completely crumbled after the collapse of the USSR. Or they have suffered infiltration by the secret state ever since the likes of MI5 agent Peter Wright bugged and burgled his way across London in a rampage in which anything left of centre was fair game, as it cleared the ground for the ascension of Thatcher and her dogma of no alternative. The socialist president, Salvador Allende of Chile, was removed in a CIA-backed coup on 9/11, 1973. The almost immediate subsequent departures, all prematurely and all under unusual circumstances, of Socialist Chancellor Willy Brandt of West Germany in March 1974, of Labour Premier Gough Whitlam of Australia in November 1975, and of Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson of Great Britain in March 1976, does raise the eyebrows somewhat. However, even this was an improvement on the secret state's usual recourse to assassination, which in the previous decade had claimed the lives of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo in 1961, Malcolm X in the United States, 1965, Che Guevara in Bolivia, 1967, and Martin Luther King in the United States on the 4th of April, 1968. So, let me repeat the question. Where can the mass of humanity find the resources to enable it to act, to take control of its own destiny against the onslaught of the market with its invisible hand and its nihilistic ideology? In recent months, we're back to Harvard mathematician Hugh Wooden added his V equals ultimate L axiom to the other axioms of mathematical set theory, and thereby brought to a close a project initiated in 1880 by George Cantor. Wooden has added the capstone to the universe of sets that obey the principle of maximality, in the sense that any intellectual entity is deemed to exist if its existence can be inferred without contradiction from the axioms that prescribe the universe. The intellectual entity exists in the world, but is not of the world. Just as Pythagoras' theorem exists and is known to be true, and yet no empirical evidence can ever prove it absolutely. As any experimental result will always be within a margin of error. The universe of sets provides an absolute universe of reference, a concept of truth, and a process of defining truth, so that the veracity or otherwise of facts and alternative facts can be established absolutely and are not reducible to matters of opinion. Wooden's axiom concludes 130 years of effort that involved thousands of mathematicians and is the most supreme achievement of purely intellectual activity ever. It is more important than the confirmation of the Higgs field, the God particle, at CERN in 2012. While this achievement in the esoteric field of pure mathematics has passed unheralded in the media, perhaps because its lucrative spin-off applications are not obvious, the result has a very concrete spin-off for our argument tonight. Wooden has demonstrated that it is possible to find, within the resources of our world, a solid, absolute reference frame for affirming truths. It confirms that we can reorient human thought towards a new common sense, by which we can tell the difference between the true and the false, without the interpretations of priests, academics, economic technocrats, central committees, or pundits. The certainties and reference points of the old symbolic order, based on such as the transcendent gods of the religions, the cunning of reason that the Hegelian Marxists rely on to fulfill history, or the market with its invisible hand, are falling like dominoes. So it is reassuring to know that a solid reference frame, an absolute ontology exists, on which a new symbolic order can be constructed. If we take the example of Ireland alone, the Catholic Church has lost the confidence of the people, racked as it is by one scandal after another, from its historic treatment of our most vulnerable baby infants and their young mothers abandoned by their families, to its continuing failure to deal in any proper way with those of its clergy that are or have been predatory. The sordid failure of the state to protect even the most vulnerable handicapped child has undermined any confidence that it can undertake even the most basic tasks it is charged with, from social services, health, education, transport and housing, let alone protect its population from the onslaught of the capricious troika. Any confidence in the Garda Síochána has been rocked to the foundations by the sordid behaviour of its senior echelons towards the whistleblowers and a million other misdemeanours. The financial institutions had lost the confidence of the population since 2008. But the sordid deals by which NAMA and the banks flogged state assets and mortgages at knockdown prices to vulture funds, but yet refused to offer the same deal to the distressed occupiers who are summarily evicted into the streets, prompts the stark question of why these institutions are shored up by the European Union while the population is cast adrift. Meanwhile, the population is caught between the hammer and anvil of rising rents and falling wages, as the logical consequences of saving the banks and sacrificing the population grind inexorably on. In a non-pathological economy, the role of the bank is to create book entries that keep account of transactions in the real economy in a sort of social bookkeeping that gathers the data necessary to inform the decisions of the monetary authority. For all of 300 years, bank book entries created at the stroke of a pen have been confused and conflated with real money created by the sweat of the human brow in a bookkeeping error that has led to the illusion that banks create real value with their book entries. It is this illusion that has converted the bank from a bookkeeper to a bookmaker, and has led to the current pathological state of the global economy with its mountains of fictitious money stocks and its bottomless pits of fictitious debt bonds, all causing untold havoc and monstrous inequality. The recognition that the bank has no magical power to create value ex nihilo provides the concrete grounding to our affirmation that there is a real alternative that can be based on real money. Indeed, we can make the additional assertion that we can begin again with a clean slate, for the double entry practices of the bank ensures that the mountains of fictitious money will exactly fill the cavernous pits of fictitious debts into which they must now be dumped. The economy of the neoliberal market is rooted in the paradox that value, which is a human construct, can be created without the touch of the human hand. In living under the rule of such inconsistency, the human animal, as spectator, falls prey to hypnotic fascination, hysteria, and mental illness, as facts and alternative facts gain equal status. But it is also the condition under which, as participant, the engaged human subject is forced to think and act with a new logic and a new common sense. So, in establishing a solid reference frame for a new logic suitable for an affirmative politics and that is inclusive of generic humanity, Marx's original slogan, "Proletarians of the world unite," coupled with the maxim of the great militant St. Paul, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither man nor woman, all are one," are most appropriate. We must also embrace Paul's other great insight. It is not by work alone that you will be saved, but grace. The grace that we identify with the socially generated value that must be distributed freely and without condition to generic humanity, thereby trusting humanity to know better how to spend its rightful income than any elite technocracy. A new attempt at the egalitarian hypothesis is not without risk. And while we must draw inspiration from their initial egalitarian impulses, there are serious lessons to be learned from the mistakes made in all prior attempts. The bloody history of the egalitarian Universalist Catholic Church, founded by St. Paul 2,000 years ago, the bloody history of egalitarian Islam, founded by Muslim in the 7th century, up to the bloody history of the egalitarian communist movement founded by Lenin in 1917, each plagued with schisms, heresies and splits since their foundations, contain salutary lessons. As we ready ourselves to begin again from the beginning, we must also be prepared to learn from our mistakes. As Rosa, we've got St. Paul here. I like this picture of St. Paul. He's got a sword in his hand and he's got two lads down the bottom with their heads chopped off. I like to think they're two bankers. So as we ready ourselves to begin again from the beginning, we must also be prepared to learn from our own mistakes. As Rosa Luxemburg put it, the modern proletarian class doesn't carry out its struggle according to a plan set out in some book or theory. The modern worker struggle is a part of history, a part of social progress. And in the middle of history, in the middle of progress, in the middle of the fight, we learn how we must fight. This new attempt is emergent and without guarantee, much like the situation of the lover when he utters the immortal words, "I love you," or the mathematician when she tackles her next hypothesis, or the artist when she touches her brush to the blank canvas. If we are to fail, we must be sure to fail better. In any case, better a failure than an apocalypse. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. So it's time to summarize our alternative propositions. So these are the April Theses 2017. So I better take another gulp before we move on to where do we go from here. Lenin presented 10 theses on April the 4th, 1917, perhaps paying unconscious homage to the mystical numerology of the number 10, dating from the biblical Bronze Age. I too will present 10 theses tonight on the 4th of April 2017. For the first 6, I select those of Lenin that, with slight modification, are appropriate to today's circumstances. For the final 4, I choose 4 protocols for testing whether a new proposition can support the creation of a new political field proposed by French philosopher Alain Badiou. So let's look at Thesis 1. So this is nearly word for word Lenin's Thesis 1, except he was in the middle of the First World War. We're slightly different. So the Thesis 1, the inextricable relationship between private appropriation and global war now and for the past 100 years must be patiently revealed. And we can happily insert global warming, species extinction, overfishing, resource exhaustion, deforestation, desertification, and as I say, whatever apocalypse you're having yourself. Private appropriation is the key to unlocking all of those. Thesis 2. The world of 2017 is not unlike the world of 1917. Is in an interim stage of instability between the end of the old order and the beginning of a new order, in which direction must be in the hands of the mass of the people. Thesis 3. There can be no support for interim populist regimes based on patriotism. This is the ugly fascistic face of capitalism, and the utter falsity of all their promises must be made clear. Thesis 4. The masses must know that the next step to egalitarianism is risky and without guarantee, but that not taking this step is even riskier. Thesis 5. A real alternative is possible based on the reappropriation of socially generated wealth from private hands and its distribution without condition to the population. Thesis 6. The role of the bank is social bookkeeping. The creation of money, the material embodiment of socially generated value, and its regulation through tax and expenditure is a possible role for the state. And now we move up to Badiou's, which are not terribly different from Lenin's anyway. Private property, with its monstrous inequality, is not natural and is not an eternal condition of human existence. Thesis 8. The opposition between intellectual and manual labour is not an eternal law. The technocratic elite, confined to their narrow behaviour and narrow thought patterns, are no wiser than the generic population. Thesis 9. It is not natural for human beings to be segregated on national, racial, religious, or sexual grounds. And thesis 10. The existence of the state is a given, but in the form of a separate, armoured, or secret power. It is not necessary. So we'll nail those to the door of the University of Limerick tomorrow. So let me conclude. As early as 1979, on accepting the Nobel Prize for Literature, the Greek poet Odysseus Elatus sensed that a dark age was descending on humanity. It is barbarism. I see it coming, masquerading under lawless alliances and predetermined enslavements. It may not be about Hitler's furnaces, but about the methodical and quasi-scientific subjugation of man, his absolute humiliation, his disgrace. And indeed, a dark age has descended as the privatization of all socially generated values has led to a form of neo-feudalism, with the economic bottom 90% increasingly driven into debt by the wealthiest 10%, and where the onslaught of realistic public opinion is corrupted with the Thatcherite no alternative and the belief that the world as it is has to stay as it is. Oscar Wilde encapsulated the appropriate attitude to this world of selfishness and self-interest when he said that a map of the world with no alternative, no utopia marked on it, was not worth a second glance. We can affirm that there is an alternative in which the full creative potential of all of humanity can be released. Valuable as the examination of the objective circumstances of our times might be, the key to our current crisis lies in humanity itself. For our problem today is to locate a new subjectivity, a new symbolic order for a new body of the faithful, with the courage to think through the mists of inconsistency and paradox, so that we may live sane and healthy lives and not be sleepwalked into madness and extinction. So tonight, I have addressed these theses not to any central committee, not to any particular subset of humanity, but to a nondescript fragment of generic humanity. Look at you, nondescript. Samuel Beckett was perhaps the one who was most alert to the function of nondescript humanity. Let's go to Godot. Let us do something while we have the chance. It is not every day that we are needed, nor indeed that we personally are needed. Others would meet the case equally well, if not better. To all mankind they were addressed, those cries for help still ringing in our ears. But at this place, at this moment of time, all mankind is us, whether we like it or not. Let us make the most of it before it is too late. Let us represent worthily, for once, the foul brood to which a cruel fate consigned us. What do you say? It is true that when with folded arms we weigh the pros and cons, we are no less a credit to our species. The tiger bounds to the help of his congeners without the least reflection, or else he slinks away into the depths of the thickets. But that is not the question. What are we doing here? That is the question. And we are blessed in this, that we happen to know the answer. So tonight, I have attempted to clear a path to this answer with a new politics that is not a continuation of the established order and its structural laws, but rather wagers on nothing but its own principles. It wagers on the bid of no trumps. Thank you very much.